We face the greatest challenge of all.
The national debt clock, it just passed $16 trillion.
When more money goes out than comes in, there's a deficit.
The debt load of the U.S. government hit $16 trillion.
Debt is high.
We also do a lot of very, very wasteful spending.
Record surplus into a yawning deficit.
People could lose confidence in the U.S. economy.
Debt will eventually crowd out everything else. That burden will ultimately fall on our children's shoulders.
Deficit is defined as a lack or shortage of something, and we have $16 trillion of it.
A representation of how large the deficit really is, it is 101% of the US GDP, and 1/16 of it, or $1 trillion, could be used to fund all the NATO countries combined.
Deficit is enormous because of the decisions taken by the George W. Bush administration. Reasons included that
$3.5 trillion came from economic changes, including lower than expected tax revenues.
$1.6 trillion came from the Bush tax cuts.
$1.5 trillion from non-defense discretionary spending.
$1.4 trillion in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars.
$1.4 trillion in incremental interest from the rising deficit.
George W. Bush wasn't the only president to add to our massive deficit.
Our current president, President Barack Obama, is a significant figure in relation to the deficit.
Today, I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office.
We're over $5 trillion deeper in debt than we were 4 years ago. How can we possibly be better off? In fact, we're so much worse off.
During Obama's first term, he enacted policies that he perceived would cut the deficit in half, but instead nearly doubled it.
The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is a $787 billion stimulus package put together by President Barack Obama in 2009. This package included $288 billion in tax cuts, $224 billion in extended unemployment benefits, education, and healthcare, and finally $275 billion for job creation using federal contracts, grants, and loans. It was meant to be spent over 10 years, but 91.5% was spent in the first 3 fiscal years. This stimulus package was added to the Bush budget, creating an additional $1.4 trillion of deficit. The package was so important because this spending was just a risk to stimulate the economy, which added to the spending of all the other commodities of the country.
Because we spend over $1 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. I say those folks who believe that it was worth us going to Iraq and Afghanistan should say how we're going to, after we cover the training and equipping of our troops, which we have to do, how they're going to make cuts for having spent so much money.
The attacks on 9/11 created the War of Terror, which took military spending to new heights. In the fiscal year of 2007, military spending went to a record of $671 billion. Defense spending increased throughout the recession to fund the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which devastated the economy and added to the deficit. President Obama and the Department of Defense spent $782 billion in the fiscal year of 2009, $663 billion in the fiscal year of 2010, $895 billion in the fiscal year of 2011, and $881 billion in the fiscal year of 2012, for a total of approximately $3.2 trillion.
Healthcare and other entitlement programs are single-handedly the biggest contribution to the deficit, consisting of about 24% of all federal spending in 2011 and 2012, and are continuing to grow as the largest government expenditure. Federal healthcare spending is on track to exceed all discretionary spending by 2016. Reasons why healthcare spending is so large is because people are living longer due to modified and improved medical technologies. Other reasons include that the number of beneficiaries for Social Security continues to grow at a substantially faster rate than the number of covered workers, and the number of people enrolled in Medicare continues to grow rapidly and is expected to grow from 47 million in 2010 to 80 million by 2030. President Obama stated in his deficit reduction plan speech that he would refuse to cut federal spending in entitlement programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, which in turn would not only increase the deficit in the coming years, but would also result in more tax revenue needed to keep the programs. Because of a rising deficit combined with President Obama and the federal government's indecisiveness to take bold action, our economy has been dragged to the edge of its capacity, the fiscal cliff.
Obama and Congress did something really unusual. They built a fiscal cliff, and there's no apparent progress towards diverting away from the cliff.
To understand more about the fiscal cliff, we went to economics teacher Dr. Rempenny. What is the fiscal cliff?
fiscal cliff, what they are referring to is a combination of tax increases and spending cuts. Okay, the nation is concerned because we had many tax cuts to various sections of the country. The Bush era tax cuts, tax cuts on businesses will be removed. And President Obama had a 2% payroll tax cut, which will go also. A series of other temporary tax cuts for business and many other things. And they have to have serious policies in place as soon as 2013 begins. That is the whole concern and discussion on fiscal cliff, as I understand.
So thank you, Dr. Penny, for your time, and it's been a pleasure.
Country. And we won't solve the problem of our fiscal imbalance overnight.
Because of failed proposals by political leaders to reduce the national deficit, we have proposed solutions to our nation's financial crisis. Federal spending is the main attributor to the national deficit. Defense and entitlement programs consist of about 50 to 60% of all federal spending each fiscal year. The U.S. spends more on defense than the next 17 countries combined. If other countries can spend substantially less on defense, so can the U.S. Now, more importantly, entitlement programs are increasing year after year as the single largest factor to the rising deficit. In 2011 alone, $1.5 trillion were spent in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. My solution to preserving these programs is simple and requires two major changes. First, increase the age requirement by 10 years for each entitlement program. This will ensure that the benefits received will last a short amount of time and therefore will preserve the programs with less the amount of money spent per year. The second part to my solution is to cut the benefits that each beneficiary receives, which will ensure that less federal money is being spent per retiree. All in all, these solutions to defense and entitlement programs will ensure a large deficit reduction for years to come.
Taxes are the other major contributor to our deficit. Because of tax benefits and cuts that most social classes are receiving, the government continues to lack in solutions to balance the deficit and the budget. Although tax cuts and reliefs are what most politicians campaign to their constituents, a proper solution is to keep taxes at an equal level for all classes. This in turn would promote success in society by keeping the tax rate constant and to also create revenue to the federal government. Another idea is to let the payroll tax cut expire and let it jump by 2%, therefore collecting $1,000 more from every taxpayer.
Mr. President, we have edged our economy over the last decade. Americans have climbed to the peak, pushing through economic obstacles. What will you do to ensure the nation that we won't fall off the cliff?